All right, so I ran the numbers after we had spent the exact same length of time in both Europe and Asia, and here's what I found. So last year, Lexi and I spent a little over 4 months traveling around Europe, and we spent over $1,600 per person per month just on transportation and housing. Now we're here in Asia, and over that exact same period of time, we spent under $600 per person per month on the same stuff. So in Asia, we spent 64% less than we did in Europe. And that's because Asia is a whole lot cheaper than Europe, right? Well, no, that's kind of an absurd statement. We're talking about two entire continents with vastly different economies scattered throughout them. There are certainly expensive parts of Europe, and there are very affordable parts of Asia, but the reverse is also true. These places are just too big. You can't compare two entire continents when talking about costs. The real reason why we spent so much less money in Asia is because we traveled a lot smarter. We made a lot of mistakes during the European part of our journey, and we corrected them by the time we got to Asia. And I'm going to tell you 5 reasons why we spent so much more money in Europe than we did in Asia. And stick around because a lot of these are kind of counterintuitive. And just to clarify, those numbers that I gave at the beginning are just for our housing and our long distance transportation. So basically, how much did we spend on places to sleep and how much did it cost to get between cities? This does not include food and tours and attractions and subway rides and all the little daily expenses. This is just the big things. All right, reason number 1 why we spent so much more money in Europe is that we did a lot more month-long stays there. So our plan going into this was that we were going to live in a different country every month and essentially get an apartment for a month in a city and kind of use that as a home base. And we thought this was going to save us money. On Airbnb, many properties, maybe even most properties, give you a pretty substantial discount if you stay for at least a month, right? You're not paying the daily rate, you're paying the much lower monthly rate. So we thought this was going to be a pretty cheap way to travel. We just stayed somewhere for a month every time. Hit that like button if you think that logic makes sense. But one thing we didn't really consider was that if we were going to stay somewhere for a whole month, we'd have reasonably high standards. Now we were still looking for budget places, right? We certainly weren't going for luxury. But if we were going to stay somewhere for a month, we wanted it to feel like a pretty nice home, and we weren't going to settle for the cheapest possible place. We were willing to spend a bit more money on comfort and convenience if we were going to commit to somewhere for a whole month. But in Asia, we traveled a lot more quickly. We still did do some month-long stays. Like, for example, we're currently in Bangkok for a month, but we also spent a lot of time moving from place to place every 4 or 5 days or every week, not staying in one place for so long. And in those situations, we were willing to go for the budget hotels and the hostels. So we actually spent a lot of time staying in places that were about $8 to $10 per night, or $4 to $5 per person. So by moving more quickly and not committing to a place for a more extended period of time, we were actually able to save a lot of money on our accommodation costs. And speaking of monthly stays, a month is kind of an awkward period of time. It's long enough that we don't want to take a risk on a super cheap place that potentially ends up being terrible. But it's short enough that it's hard to find an actual apartment lease at something closer to the market rate. To this day, Airbnb is still the best way we found to get a place for just a month. But even with all the monthly discounts in Airbnb, we're definitely still paying quite a heavy premium for the convenience. So we actually plan on trying something new later this year. We want to move to Da Nang, Vietnam for 3 months, right? 3 whole months, and just skip Airbnb entirely. Just walk into apartment buildings and see if we can work with any of them directly. So if that works out, we should be able to save even more money on our housing costs. All right, reason number 2 why we spent so much money in Europe is because we did way too many expensive weekend trips. So like I said, going into this, our plan was just to move to a different city every month, get an apartment for a month and kind of live like locals. And unfortunately, every time we got to a new place, we'd start getting into this mentality of we're only going to be in this area of the world for a short while, so we need to see as much as possible. We need to go as many places as possible. So let's do a weekend trip. And, one weekend trip turned into 2, turned into 3, and we just kept doing these weekend trips to see as much of the region as possible. And we never thought we'd be spending too much money when we started planning these trips. Like for example, when we were staying in Sofia, Bulgaria for a month, we decided to go to Istanbul for a weekend. We found that hostels were pretty affordable there, and it's only like less than a 90-minute flight away. So we figured, hey, why not go there for a weekend? Unfortunately, the flight ended up being pretty expensive, right? Round trip flight from Sofia to Istanbul. So it turned out to actually not be that cheap of a weekend after all. On the flip side, when we were based in Prague, we found that it was super affordable to travel around Czechia by train. Basically $10 can get you halfway across the country. So we figured, why not go to Český Krumlov for a weekend? And the train to get there was very affordable, but the housing was not. It's a super small town and quite a popular place to visit. So housing was pretty expensive. And again, what we thought would be a cheap weekend turned out not to be. Now that one was totally worth it because Český Krumlov ended up being my favorite place in all of Europe, but we definitely paid for it. And for some of our weekend trips, everything was expensive. So for example, when we were staying in Naples, Italy for a month, we decided we wanted to go up north for a weekend, stay in Milan and then see Lake Como and Cinque Terre. And wow, we spent a lot of money that weekend. The round trip train going up north and then back south again was very expensive. We could not find an affordable place to stay in Milan, so we ended up spending a lot on that. Even things like food was more expensive up there. Like everything was just more expensive, and that weekend trip just straight up was not worth it. Like we could have had just as good a time exploring more of the Campania region, which would have been basically free since we were already staying there to begin with. So what are we doing differently in Asia? Well, it's pretty simple really. Before we go on a weekend trip, we just make sure that both the transportation and the accommodations are affordable. So we've still done some weekend trips in Asia from our home bases. We're just more strategic about where we go. And if we can't find a place that's both cheap to get to and cheap to stay in, we just don't do a weekend trip that weekend, which has also been great because everywhere we've stayed as a home base has had so many things to see and do and eat. So like we no longer feel like we constantly need to do a weekend trip to get the most out of a given region. All right, reason number 3 why we spent so much money in Europe is that we planned too far ahead. Now this one feels especially counterintuitive. Planning ahead should be a good thing, right? Well, no, we found that the way to save money isn't by planning ahead, it's by being flexible. And those two things are often at odds with each other. So for example, months before this whole travel adventure began, we decided we wanted to live in Prague for a month. So we looked on Airbnb, found an apartment in a good location at a pretty good price, and we were like, we need to lock this in right now. So we ended up booking this apartment 6 months in advance. And now that I say it now, it sounds insane. It is absolutely insane, booking a place 6 months in advance, but that's what we did before we knew what we were doing. We literally booked a non-refundable apartment in Prague 6 months before we were planning on going there. Now, what ended up happening during that same months is that it worked out that Lexi's mom could come visit Europe for about a week and a half. So Lexi and her mom did a little trip to Scandinavia while we were based in Prague, where Lexi's mom was gonna pay for the hotels and stuff. So if we had been flexible, we essentially could have avoided housing costs for a week and a half. But because we had committed so long in advance to this apartment in Prague, we had to pay for it no matter what. Now, here in Asia, we have been doing everything a lot more last minute. to the point where we often don't even know where we're going to be until about a day or two before. Or if we're going to stay somewhere for a month, we'll plan it about a week in advance. And that has opened us up to situations where we're able to be flexible and we're able to take advantage of situations where we're able to stay with some generous people for free. So for example, once again, Lexi's mom wanted to come visit us in Asia, and she wanted to go on a trip to Japan where we could stay in her hotel rooms. And because we were so flexible and we planned everything so last minute, we were able to just completely plan around when she wanted to come. Or another time, we weren't even planning on visiting South Korea, but we found out that one of our friends has an uncle who lives there, and he had a place where there was a 2-week window where we could stay there for free. And again, because we didn't really have any plans, we were able to just jump on that opportunity, that 2-week window, and stay in South Korea for 2 weeks for free. Reason number 4 why we spent so much money in Europe is that we planned way too much around specific destinations and events. So we kind of had a wish list of things we wanted to do and see in Europe. I really wanted to go to Oktoberfest in Munich. Lexi really wanted to go to Paris. We both wanted to go to Germany in December, hop around various cities and go to Christmas markets. And all of these must-do things were not only expensive on their own, but they further limited our flexibility and also created some kind of weird travel routes. So we tried to spend as much time as possible in the more affordable countries farther east in Europe. But then because of these things we really wanted to do and see, we kept going west and going east again, then west and east. And we were zigzagging around Europe to try to hit these specific things. And that really made the transportation costs add up. But in Asia, we went in without any sort of list of things we must see or things we must do. We did have Taylor Swift tickets ahead of time, so we knew we needed to be in Singapore on a specific date. But that was literally the only thing we had planned for the entire year. Nothing else. So now, whenever we're trying to figure out our next move, we don't really plan around where we want to go. We just look at, what are the most affordable places to get to from where we are. And then out of those, which places have, reasonably affordable accommodation. And then once we, filter that down, then we figure, okay, so what are the places we actually want to go to? And this approach sounds limiting, right? It sounds like we're making sacrifices in terms of where we go in order to save a bunch of money. But I really don't think that's the case, because this approach has brought us to so many places that we wouldn't have thought of going otherwise that ended up being amazing. Like Malaysia. I never would have thought of going to Malaysia. I feel like Malaysia is just not really a place that most Americans really know anything about. But it turns out flights in and out of Malaysia are super, super affordable. Like even by Southeast Asian standards, flights in and out of Malaysia are some of the cheapest in the entire region. So we ended up spending about 5 weeks in Malaysia, and it was absolutely incredible. We spent most of our time in Georgetown, Penang, where there's a huge Chinese population, and we just happened to be there in February during Chinese New Year. And some of those celebrations they had there were some of the richest cultural experiences I've had in this entire traveling journey. I still think about it all the time, and I think our time in Malaysia was way better than if we had just gone to somewhere on our bucket list or somewhere we'd wanted to go. We just had such an incredible time by going somewhere that wasn't really on our radar before we started. And finally, this is a big one. Reason number 5 why we spent so much money in Europe is that we were with our dog. And this just brought about so many indirect expenses that we didn't really consider ahead of time. Now, don't get me wrong, it was totally worth it. We love traveling with our dog, Nala, and we can't wait to travel with her again. But when we are with her again, we're just gonna need to be a little more careful about our spending. So, what are the costs associated with traveling with the dog? Well, there are some direct ones, like the flights. Whenever we flew with Nala, we always had to pay a dog fee that was usually around $70 US. And then there's also vet bills and health certificates and various things you need to take a dog across international borders. But all those are kind of negligible in the grand scheme of things. The big costs are the indirect ones. Basically all of the times where we had to forego something cheaper because we had a dog with us. So a big one is planes. I mentioned the dog fee earlier, but the larger expense comes from just not being able to fly budget airlines. So it can be super affordable to fly around Europe on airlines like Ryanair and Wizz Air, but all of those airlines are just completely off limits to us because they don't allow dogs to fly on them. So if you want to see the actual numbers, here's a good example. So at one point we needed to fly from Bucharest to Paris, and we looked on Google Flights and we found a $17 Ryanair flight. Now when you add all the bag fees and all that stuff, the Ryanair flight would have cost $108 between the two of us. But we couldn't fly Ryanair because we had a dog, so we needed to go with a dog-friendly airline. And the cheapest one we could find ended up costing us $428 for the two of us and our dog. So essentially, just because we had a dog with us, we ended up spending an extra $320 on that flight. Now, sure, I could have flown by myself on the budget airline, and Lexi could have flown with Nala on the dog-friendly airline, or vice versa. But flying with a dog is already super stressful, and we didn't want to have to split up just to save some money. So we essentially sucked it up and ended up paying for 2 flights on the dog-friendly airline. That's what we've done on every single flight we've flown together with Nala. And it's not just airlines that are off limits to us. Buses are as well. Most long-distance buses do not allow dogs. And buses can often be a very affordable and sometimes very, very comfortable way to get around. But because we have a dog with us, those are just not an option for us. Now, when it comes to hotels and Airbnbs, some of them do allow dogs, but many of them do not. The ones that do sometimes charge a dog fee, sometimes they don't, but again, that's negligible. The real cost is just the more limited housing supply you have. The fact that you have to filter out a bunch of potentially cheaper options because they don't allow dogs. But that's not even the biggest indirect expense that comes from traveling with a dog. The biggest one is just not being able to take advantage of as much free housing from family and friends because we have our dog. So for example, one time we were going to Nuremberg, and I posted something about that on Facebook, and my cousin's old nanny, who I hadn't talked to in like 20 years, turns out she lives in Nuremberg and offered us her guest room. So we could have had a free place to stay there, which would have been awesome. But she has cats, and understandably, she didn't want a dog staying with her. And luckily, Nuremberg isn't too pricey, so that was fine. But the big one was Paris. So we decided we wanted to spend a week in Paris, and my good friend's parents actually have an apartment in Paris, right along the river, right by a lot of the touristy stuff we wanted to do. Absolutely perfect location. And again, they offered us their guest room, but understandably, they didn't want a dog staying with them. So what could have been one of our cheapest traveling weeks ever turned out to, I think to this day, our most expensive week. We spent $2,000 on an Airbnb for that week, which was one of the cheapest dog-friendly Airbnbs we could find. It was in a much worse location than if we had stayed with my friend's parents. So everything just ended up being worse and more expensive because we had a dog. But in Asia, we left our dog with Lexi's parents, at least for this stretch of the journey. So now all of the cheapest options are at our disposal. Now we can take those $4 buses between cities. We can take those $30 flights. We can take those, we can stay in those $8 apartments. We can stay in places for free when opportunities come up. So now we can truly be budget travelers now that we don't have that added constraint of everything needing to be dog friendly. Now, does that mean we are giving up on traveling with a dog? Well, no, we miss Nala a ton, and we don't ever want to be apart from her for this long ever again. It just means that when we do travel with Nala again, we're just gonna need to be much smarter about it. So I mentioned later this year we want to move to Da Nang, Vietnam for 3 months. And in that case, we're just gonna find an actual apartment, try to find a dog-friendly apartment that is much cheaper than a dog-friendly Airbnb would be for only a month. And we're probably gonna take Nala back to Europe next year, and we're just gonna need to plan more along the train routes. So taking trains can be a really great way to get around Europe, depending on the route. And we found that most European trains do allow dogs, and they don't even charge a fee for small dogs. So if we just travel by train, we aren't really limiting our options at all. So hopefully you can see by now that when I talk about Europe and Asia in this video and how much we spent in each place, it really has nothing to do with the continents themselves. It has everything to do with our strategy, how we travel. But there is one exception. One thing I think is generally much cheaper in Asia than it is in Europe, pretty much across the board, is food. Even in the more expensive Asian countries, I found that food is more affordable than it is in even the cheapest European countries. Now, I made a whole other video about that, so go check that out if that's something you're interested in, and I will see you in the next one.